in with this updated guidance on cluster analysis, just to find out, what's happening on your system. And we also revised heavily the calibration piece. When we wrote the 2004 methodology, that we were still learning a lot about microsimulation, and the calibration was pretty extensive, and we were trying to calibrate to everything and anything within the model. And what we have found over the years, it's really cumbersome. And so we revised the calibration process to just focusing in on travel time and bottlenecks. Those are the two major things that we focus in on. And we did, I won't say discount, but we did focus in on the demand and some of those other activities that's there. And so everything in here now is basically derived from observed data. What we want to do was have something that's data driven. And so that's where the new cluster analysis, the calibration process that's there. And what we're hoping for through this process is we can have a repeatable and automatable process that's out there. And so here's some of the motivation. Back in 2004, we were data scarce. Now there's plenty of data that's out there. And now the biggest thing here is what we want to do is get away from that average day where we're grooming the data. We're spending a lot of time on that. Now we just want to focus on, what are the data out there, and then just go from there. And then, leveraging some of the new data sources out there, from everything from crowdsourcing to also commercially available data that's within the system. And so those are the things that we went through. And one of the big thing in the new process is capturing this reliability space. That's something we've talked about over the years. And so a lot of you guys, what you're doing is a lot of the activities that you're doing with microsimulation is still focused on geometric, but the new methodology allows you to also expand into that reliability space. And so some of the guiding principle of microsimulation here is, clear objective, hypotheses, well-defined performance. And what we want when we say objective and hypothesis, what we want to do is get away from the NEPA process where we're, the mom and apple pie, improving congestion, those big broad terms. We want to get into very specific objective within the modeling process, and how do we use the performance measure to vet that. Select the appropriate tool, making sure that we have sufficient budgets for and from a resource and time standpoint, and available sufficient data. The biggest thing that you will see in the new update is we ask for a year's worth of data, but we can live with 100 days. But we have done projects less than that, and so it's a matter of what is the objective of your project, and how much data do you really need, and is there data available out there? And I'll give some examples of some of the innovative ways with some of the firms have gone out there and secured the data without, everybody thinks that they got to go out there and put a tube across the highway for 100 days or a year. That's not what we're looking for. And so here, the 7-step process is still there. We didn't want to go and do a wholesale change of the volume 3. So what you see is we updated chapter 2 data collection and analysis. That's where the cluster analysis comes in. We updated the calibration, and also the alternative analysis. And all this is based on statistical method, data-driven type of activities that's in here. So what I'll do is kind of go through the 7 chapters in here. Chapter 1 is microsimulation analysis planning. What we're talking about there is putting together a framework on how you're going to conduct the analysis. That's what we're looking for in chapter 1 there. Identifying, how do you differentiate between the no bill and the bill? What MOEs are you going to pull out of there? And then how are you capturing the geographical and temporal space within the model itself, and an appropriate technical approach. And so those are some of the key activities that we talked about in chapter 1. In chapter 2, that's where we get into the data collection analysis. And this is the new piece, identifying the different travel conditions within your network, and using cluster analysis to kind of identify that. And some of the big thing out of here is measure and flow and estimate demand, or estimate or forecast demand. The biggest thing that we were looking for is this concept of flow conservation. If you look at the speed flow curve, everything there's a direct relationship of demand and speed. And so what we want to do is we want to capture a holistic day. And that's one of the things that you'll find in the new methodology is we don't calibrate to a synthetic day, but we actually calibrate to an existing or an actual day in space that has that flow conservation that we're looking for. And some of the contemporary data that's out there to understand how your system is doing. And so some of the dangers of applying a data scarce method in a data rich environment. And so this is where when we did the research and updates in 2016, this is what we find. People were throwing out bad weather days with crash or incident, or days, different days. So we focus all of our activities on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. We forget, Monday, Friday, holidays, day before the holidays. So if you look at bad weather day, incident days, and you throw away all those other days, you're throwing away over 2/3 of your data. And so if you're talking to the traveling public, you're telling them that we're analyzing only 1/3 of the days within your network. How would they feel? And so that's where one of the things that we looked at is how do we capture all the different characteristics within the network or travel condition with the network, and then from there we can then make a decision of how we're going to address the outcome of the project based on the objective that's there, and then we can use the right cluster or the data set. And so here's all these spaghetti strings you see on here is from the 405 up in the greater Seattle area, and each one of those strings represents a day. So if you take that average travel time or that average day there, are we forgetting all the stuff that's above that, like the worst case travel time or the best case travel time? Those days actually, those days actually occurred within space. And so is it appropriate to discount that? And so that's where we were getting at, is how do we capture, how do we find all the different characteristics there, and then identify which one of those clusters that we actually want to execute or analyze. And all the different travel can help us make some effective investments, better understanding the source of variability within the system. Is it weather? Is it incident? If it is, what can we do to fix those things? Impact of compounding factors, identify condition where one alternative outweighs another. And so one of the big thing that we look at in this new piece is, once you build a geometric, can you get other improvements out of it with operational strategies? And so if we focus everything that's in that little circle here that says normal, no accident expected, clear weather, that Chamber of Commerce day. So we're only focusing on a very small percentage of the travel space. And is that right? If we do that. So those are some of the things that we want to look at. And so with this new process where we go into cluster analysis, whether you capture 100 days or a year worth of data, or some of the projects I've worked on in California, Texas, and whatever else, we were able to get 40 days or 50 days worth of data. But at least we can then go into using the K-mean process of identifying similar travel conditions within those 40 or 50 days, or the number of days that we have, where we can group them into similar characteristics, so we can see what's happening on that system. And so as you can see in here, all cluster analysis is we're just grouping different days or similar days together. That's all it is. So that's the big thing here. Observe data using cluster analysis to identify distinct travel conditions for the network itself. So once you find that those different clusters, then you identify what we call the centroid or the representative day. What day that's in the middle of that cluster. That's going to be the representative day. And so what we're doing now is in the calibration process, we focus everything on that representative day with all the data associated with that day to go through calibration. And as we calibrate to travel time and bottleneck, what we have found is that amount of time it takes to go through the calibration is a little bit less or a lot less than what it was in the old 2004 methodology, where we're calibrating to a synthetic day, a day that never really happened, and a lot of times we lose that flow conservation that's associated with it. And so the base model development in this manual is still the same. Basically, you're using Google Earth, or you're using some other tools to aid you in the development of that base model. And depending on the tools you use, it will dictate that aspect of it. Error checking is still the same. What known bugs are there in the software that you're using? And I'm using geographic and animation to make sure that all your links and connectors are connected. I've seen models where they just fall off into space. So that's all this. Those activity hasn't changed from 2004 to 2018. This is the other updates that we did here. Is the purpose of calibration is systematic calibration. We're turning one knob at a time to see if we can reproduce what's happening out in the field. The big thing in this new methodology is calibration selectively. We only focus on those two key performance measures, travel time and bottlenecks within here. And so here's the criteria that's associated with this. And so we have 4 new criteria where we totally define what exactly they are in the updated net software. In the 2004, when we wrote that, we weren't 100% sure, so there was a lot of ambiguities that was embedded in the 2004 methodology, and some of the state DOT, took it on themselves to update those processes where they combine combination of travel demand calibration with microsimulation calibration. So here now in the 2019, we have an opportunity where we just focus in on microsimulation only MOEs. And so big thing here, that the 3 key steps in here is identifying that representative day for each of the cluster or the cluster for which you are building your geometric tours. Prepare the variation envelope around the representative day and then calibrate to the 4 new criterion. Here's the 4 new criterion. The first one is, what we want to do is constrain the number of outliers in the results. And then second one is control the minimum number of inliers. So that's where the 1 sigma and 2 sigma band comes in. Basically, what we're looking for is 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviation from the average day in travel time. How do we build those two bands? And then the number 3 and number 4 is controlling the bounded average error and also the systematic error. All we're looking for in there is that we don't want that model to over or underestimate the travel time associated within the network itself. And so, identifying the representative, why do we need to do, again, this gets back to what we want to do within the representative day is just trying to capture that flow conservation that's in there. And so here's part of that representative day activity there. This is not the same as that average day in the cluster. It's an actual day that so that average day it's going to somewhere in the middle. In the middle of the cluster itself, but the representative day is an actual day in space that has all of the characteristics of your travel time, your demand, all the traffic data that you have collected for that day. And so one of the nice thing about this new process is you can see, you might have a low demand day, you might have a medium demand day with incidents in there, and then you might have a high demand or an incident that causes travel travel time to spike. So all those activities are within your model space. And so how do you select the right one to do the analysis on? And so the big thing here is, again, the first step here is getting the actual travel time itself. Once you do that, then working through the statistical process, identifying what is the standard deviation of the travel time that's associated with in there. And then what we do is we build the thick band, the thin band. The thick band, all it is 2 standard deviation. The thin band is 1 standard deviation at 95% confidence level. That's all it is. And so this is what the variation envelope would look like in the calibration process. This is the travel time of your representative day, and then the purple lines here is the 1 standard deviation, and then the green dotted line is going to be your 2 standard deviation at 95% confidence level. And again, just this is the 4 criterion: controlling the number of outliers, inliers, and then the bounded average error and the systematic error associated with it. And the biggest thing here in the calibration process, again, is we're turning one knob at a time, looking at whether it's from the driver behaviors or whatever else that you need to do within your model space or within your model. You want to tweak that one thing at a time to see where it comes from. And what we have found over our research as we develop this new guidance document is, because we only focused in on travel time and bottleneck, our calibration process has become a lot easier. Remember the old 2004 methodology? We calibrate to a whole bunch of different metrics that's out there, or MOEs, and it's like plug in dam. When you put your finger in one hole, it squirts out somewhere else. That's typical of the calibration process when we have too many different parameters that's out there. And so in this new criterion, the first one is what we're looking at here is that this 2 sigma band. What we want to do is have 95% of the time variant, or basically you can see the green line here with the diamonds, and then your simulated time in there. What we want to do is have all the simulated time, at least 95% of them, falls within those 2 sigma band. And then same thing here in the 1 sigma band. We're looking at 2/3 of it, or 66%, with the caveat that you also need to pick a critical time period within that model space. And so you identify 2 critical time period, non-consecutive, and you got to ensure those critical time falls within the 1 sigma band. So there's a little caveat to criterion 2 that's in there. And the criterion 3, the bounded average error. This is the rationale behind it. On average, all we're looking here is that the results are close to the observed data, so that we don't have an overestimation or an underestimation of it. And it's based on the absolute values within the model or within the error itself. And the criterion 4 is the systematic error. Again, what we're looking at is not excessive over or underestimation of the travel time associated with it. And so there's 2 checks in there at the end for criterion 3 and 4. And then the alternative analysis, as we get into, one of the things that we revise in here in the alternative analysis is that we want you to go through and using statistical analysis to say that using the null hypothesis that you have no reason to dispute the model itself. And that's the key point in here, using some of the different statistical analysis to basically weigh between the no bill and the bill options, or if you're doing some operational improvements or whatever, you can still use some of those other cluster to analyze the alternative analysis, basically focusing on the competing alternative that's there. And so that's all that we talked about in there. And the number of model runs, this is a little bit different than the old methodology. So in the old methodology, when you do the calibration, you do a whole bunch of different runs to get that uh, uh, the um, to get an average across them. In the new methodology, in our calibration process, we do only one run. The only time we do multiple runs is in the alternative analysis. And that's where one of the things that we also look at in the alternative analysis is you got to understand what is the error tolerance of the data in the field to allow you to set up that null hypothesis and identify the number of run that satisfies that 95th% confidence level. Or you can go to in the new methodology in 2004, we allow you to figure out what is the confidence level of your calibration and your alternative analysis. In the new methodology, the calibration is focusing in on 95th percentile confidence level, but in the competing alternative or the in the competing alternative here, or the alternative analysis, what we do is we allow you the flexibility to identify what is the confidence level of the results that you're looking for. So you can vary that from anywhere from 80 to 95%. So that allows you the flexibility to determine what is the appropriate number of runs for each of the output or the results model itself. And here's just, it's a basic number. And so one of the things that you will see in the 1 and 2 sigma band is we focus in on the Z statistics where 95th percentile is 1.96, but in here at the minimum number run, we use the T statistics. So there's 2 statistics process that's used here. One is the T statistics in here for the minimum number of runs, whereas in the alternative analysis, we just went straight to the Z statistics of 95th percentile is going to be 1.96. And so there's some minor differences in the analysis that's in there. And you go through and calculate the null hypotheses. Can you reject or not reject the analysis that you have done? And so here in the system, the sensitivity analysis, one of the things that I've done with some of my state partners or stakeholders is that they select a predominant cluster. So let's say California is one of the states. They identify 42 days using the PEMS data, and then within those 42 days, they found that one of the predominant cluster had like 20 some days out of the 40 days, over 50%. And so that's what they're going to base their geometric improvements on. And then some of those other minor cluster, they had some high demand cluster in there. So now that you have that data, when you do the sensitivity analysis, instead of just varying the demand arbitrarily by 20% or whatever, now that you have actual data in the field that says the high demand day is 18.7, or you can actually use that cluster to do that high demand cluster and just go through a brief calculation or a calibration, because you already done most of it in the predominant or the dominant cluster. Just some minor tweaking in the high demand cluster, then you can use that to say, based on the data that's out there, the high demand time might be 25%, maybe 30%, and maybe 15%, whatever it is. At least you have some data where you're not just putting an arbitrary number in there, where you're actually using a real number that came from the data itself. So that's some of the other nice things that you get out of this. And then of course the last chapter is our final report, where you just putting together how to tell your story. And so some of the ongoing efforts that we have, so what we have right now is we're doing a case study in Minnesota, Colorado, and Florida with our one of our contractors. And what they're doing is they're taking 3 projects, one in Minnesota, one in Colorado. Minnesota, I can't remember the location, but Colorado's C470. Florida is on I-95. And what they're doing is they're going through and applying the 2019 volume 3, going through the entire cluster analysis and also the simulation of all clusters. And then what they're going to do is they're going to come up with what is the level of effort that's going to be associated with that. And then also they're going to try to figure out some best practices, and then hopefully we can get that done here within the next 12 to 18 months to aid you guys in providing, you know, some additional guidance out there. And we might revise some of the stuff that's in here based on the case study that's going to come out of here. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Randy, for questions.
All right. Sorry, it took us a second to get the mic unmuted. All right. Well, thank you, John, for the presentation there. So we did get one question, and since we only have one, we could go ahead and address that now. Dave Stanek asked, for a 10-mile corridor, study corridor, you have a year of volume data for 25% of the study locations. What would you recommend to obtain volume data for the other 75% of the locations? Can you use a one-day count to fill in the gaps?
So this is very good question. We had this similar project up in the Spence Bridge in Ohio, extensive piece, and they had some data that's out. You know, they went out there. They had a combination. They used a combination of ATRs for certain locations, and then they went back as an anchoring system. You know, if you want to call it that. Within the ATR, and then from there they expanded out using a combination of INRIX and streetlight data, so commercially available data to fill in the gaps. And so the question is, if you had a one-day count, you know, could you fill that in? That's going to be hard, because that one day, unless you can associate that with, you know, an actual day within the network to see what the differential is. So my recommendation would be to take a look at, see what commercially available data that's out there that you can extrapolate from. And right now, we have INRIX, we have streetlights, WEJO. I've seen a number of people are starting to use that data set, and the federal highway available data. Also, the biggest thing with the commercially available data or some of the other data format is understanding what the number of samples that's in the data set and what confidence level can you draw out of that. I see Eric is on the call. Eric is the one who did the Spence Bridge there.
Hey, John.
Hey, Eric.
All right, so we did get a handful of other questions come in. John, feel free to go through and reply directly via chat. We could also circle back to those towards the end. But I did have one follow-up statement on your response there. So if you did do manual traffic counts to fill in those gaps, could you also basically do the counts for the locations where you do have enough data to do cluster analysis, and then compare the individual count days to how they fit within the cluster of data?
Yeah, how we extrapolate is still kind of a wild west, and so I won't say we have all the answers to that. The biggest thing is you know, is from the consultant community or from the state's perspective, is provide us with a methodology, and then can we all live with your proposed methodology? And there's not a right answer or wrong answer for this at this point.
Okay.
The biggest thing is you know, once you complete your extrapolations and whatever else, do we have confidence in the data, and can we live with it?
Okay. And last comment here, it looks like Jim Starrick has a comment. Since he's FHWL, let him go ahead and chime in here.
Randy, I think one of the things we're perhaps haven't really hit on here is that we're looking at the year's worth of data to understand the demand variation throughout the year. So we're not necessarily looking to capture the demand variation at all locations throughout the facility. We're looking at basically what we want to see is what the demand variation is on, on specific locations. So if it's representative locations throughout the facility and they're spaced, in a way that makes sense, what David's talking about in terms of 25%, that would be more than sufficient. It actually may be more points than what we want to need, or we want to be inputting into the cluster analysis to be able to identify, what our clusters are and what our representative days are. Then what we've talked about is, it's the same thing we've been doing with the 2004 methodology. You're going to be trying to weave together whatever manual counts you have on your arterial facilities to ensure that your flow is consistent into your major uninterrupted flow facility. So all we're really doing is looking at those continuous count stations, typically those ATRs, on our uninterrupted flow facilities, to really cascade back into our origin destination matrix estimations that we'd be utilizing anyways in the 2004 methodology. So we're not really looking for 100 days, or excuse me, a year's worth of data on the entire network. We're just looking at spot locations, and typically those are going to be the ATRs that you have out there already.
Perfect. I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, well, we can continue the conversation on that topic in the chat. So if you have further questions, feel free to drop them in, and Chung, Jim, or anybody else in the meeting here, if feel free to keep an open discussion going on in that chat room. All right, I'm going to take the presentation here. All right. So Chung gave us a great overview and understanding of what the federal guidelines are, what level of data that you need, the types of statistical analysis, and ultimately the process that you go through to get it to modeling. So we did a little case study here at DKS. So I just want to do a quick presentation on this. And one thing I want to stress is this is not an actual project, so this isn't an agency-sponsored project by any means. This was just an internal exercise we did here at DKS to get a better understanding of local data availability and the quality of that data. Basically, do we have enough data to readily do cluster analysis without any large data acquisition purchase? So for this exercise, this was a couple years ago, using 2019 data. We looked at the I-5 northbound bottleneck. So Interstate 5 goes north of Portland, Oregon, crosses over the Columbia River Bridge into Vancouver, Washington. And it's a notorious bottleneck, one of the top, I guess it's the top 33rd bottleneck in the country. So it's a pretty horrendous commute that a lot of folks do. And so we wanted to see if we could get a good understanding of those operations. So for the data that we have, we utilized free data sources that we have in the Portland metro area. So Portland State University has a system called Portal. It's a transportation data archive. That allowed us to get mainline and ramp volumes for the freeway, as well as speed data. And then through NOAA, you could get weather data that includes weather, precipitation, visibility, and wind. And then ODOT has a incident data set. So there's certainly additional data sets that you can apply to cluster analysis. This is just what we had readily available. We also focused on a relatively narrow time period, looking at non-holiday weekday PM peak between 3 to 8 p.m. And then through that, we developed measures of VMT, vehicle hours traveled, and vehicle hours of delay. and we developed all these dependent variables through these data sets into a database. And then probably the most time-consuming part and the most important part is cleaning the data. So you want to make sure that you do that full data validation. In our cases, a lot of the detector records had gaps in the data. So we had to go through, toss out those days that had substantial gaps, and just go through that sort of general cleaning process. In the end, we ended up with about 160 days of observations once we got rid of all the bad detector data. Because in one day you may have one detector bad, on the next day you may have another. So understanding those gaps is really important. So now onto the cluster analysis itself. I'm not going to go into the details. You know, you could certainly dive into this at a PhD level and get pretty deep. And I think that right there is a big hurdle for a lot of folks to use cluster analysis, is not understanding the statistics or having the skills to use various statistical analysis packages. So if you don't have that skill set with your agency or your firm, this is where I think as an industry, we could do a better job providing some training on these models and tools and methods. And it's really not that difficult, but I think for a lot of folks, that's a barrier to going and using this process. But we went ahead and we used MATLAB with this Gaussian mixture model. Some of the other programs that you could use are Python or R. There's a handful out there. And then in terms of the models for the clustering, there's the k-means clustering method, the GMM method that we used, and there's also a spectral clustering. The one thing you got to realize, though, is that it's possible that not all the variables that you input are going to turn out into your cluster analysis. So you might find that some of these have low cluster rates, low correlation rates, and you might drop out some of these variables. So in our case, the weather had a very low correlation, so none of the weather data really corresponded to the congestion data, as well as the freeway incident data. And initially that took me a bit by surprise. I expected to see higher congestion with higher incidences. But as we found with looking at some California freeway data, when you have recurrent congestion that's well beyond your jam density, you're fully saturated day in, day out, a lot of those incidences don't have a substantial impact on the overall throughput. Now, of course, you have, a semi-truck flips on its side and blocks the freeway. That's obviously going to be a different story. But the bulk of the reported incident data did not have a high correlation. Now, in terms of the analysis results, you don't click a button and here is the result. So there's a couple different outcomes that you might end up with. Ultimately, we ended up with results of either a 2 or a 3 cluster analysis. And these clusters were based on VHD and VMT. That's where we found the high correlation rates. And in both cases, we have high demands with high delays shown there in red. The one off to the left, they're different colors, but those are the moderate demand with moderate delay. But then we were able to identify a potential third cluster of high demand, moderate delay. Now, this is where it's important to understand, like, what are you trying to analyze or understand about your system? So I don't know if you guys can see my mouse here, but if you were to just sort of take the average of all this data, your centroid is going to be far below the centroid of the red dot there. And so those moderate demands are going to bring that average down. And so if you go through and do that, you might find operations look a little less congested than you might otherwise expect. So this is where you can go through and really try to isolate the data to that cluster if that's really what the project goals are trying to resolve. Now, interpreting those results, cluster analysis does not reduce the need for good engineering judgment. You still have to take the time, do a reality check with your data, look at the number of clusters, do a visual inspection of reasonableness on them, you know, kind of look at the scatter of the data, look at the values of the parameters that you're looking for a comparison, look at the model goodness of fit criteria. And then you need to ask yourself, what clusters are relevant to the project? So again, going back to the high demand, high delay scenario here in red, if you're trying to do a bottleneck mitigation study and reduce some of these high delay scenarios, or maybe it's travel demand management, some TDM measures to reduce some of those higher demands, then maybe looking at the data in the moderate demand, moderate delay has less value for your particular project. So you just kind of need to think about what your project goals are relative to the data that you're seeing through the analysis. And you may need to do some further refinement on the analysis. You know, we were trying to get an idea of really what are the differences between the high demand, high delay and high demand, moderate delay. Given that incidences and weather didn't seem to have a good correlation there. One hypothesis is it has to do with the change in the weaving volumes through this segment approaching the bridge. And so that would be one thing if we were going to do further analysis, is look at additional OD data. There's a variety of sources out there from Streetlight and Replica and INRIX, and see if that's a contributing factor. Look at additional years to see how patterns change. And then ultimately look at the individual cluster performance measures. So the plots here in the lower right come directly from the FHWA guidelines, and it's showing the travel time and bottleneck throughput over a full day. And you can see for the individual clusters what those results are. So if you could isolate that in the data or simulate that, it just allows you to get a better understanding of the details related to a particular cluster. So a few key takeaways here. Ultimately, cluster analysis is going to help you provide a deeper understanding of your corridor operations. So you can answer all kinds of questions. You know, how many days a year are impacted by weather or incidences? How many days of a year have high versus medium versus low congestion? Through the question between Dave Stanek's question and response we were just having about validating traffic count data. You know, we could certainly use the cluster analysis, and we have a set of counts for the entire corridor. How do the counts that overlap where we do have the data, how does that fit relative to the cluster we're interested in? So there's a lot of good questions here you can answer just by doing a corridor study, diagnosing a corridor, even if you're not going to be taking this into modeling. So I think that's a big takeaway, is this isn't just for developing model input volumes. Cluster analysis also helps us select the right data for the analysis. You certainly got to do the data cleaning and the validation. That's incredibly important. And ultimately, it's going to help you reduce the risk of creating a calibrated model that doesn't necessarily match field observations or expectations. So again, if you're calibrating to an average data set that sort of brings down the overall delay, you might statistically calibrate that model in terms of meeting criteria thresholds, but you're not going to be meeting the field conditions, which may be more what the agency expectations are. So a little more work up front on the data analytics before building the model goes a long way. With that in mind, though, the project scope, schedule, and budget need to account for any data acquisition costs or analysis. So make sure you have that budget, that schedule to account for those. But that doesn't mean that cluster analysis is expensive and time consuming. So this little exercise we did here was with completely free data. You know, we, at the time, a couple of years ago, we were relatively new to the process and the whole thing probably took less than 20 hours. But certainly there's a lot more analysis and deeper dives that we could do on that, use additional data sets. So that was just sort of an exploratory exercise, but it definitely highlights the high value of doing cluster analysis. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation here. Let's see, stop sharing my screen for a second. All right, looks like there's a handful of questions there. I want to make sure Chris has time to get in and give his spiel. So let's go ahead and hand it over to Chris, and then we'll use any remaining time to go through and address any comments.
Thank you, Randy. Just a quick mic check.
Great.
Yeah,
All right.
good.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. I do have a few slides up, but my section will be pretty quick. Let me just swap this out. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Chris Melson. I'm the manager of the Transportation Planning Analysis Unit here at the Oregon DOT. And Randy did invite us to provide some updates on our analysis procedures manual. And I'm kind of here on behalf of Peter Skydema. Peter Skydema was definitely more of the expert in this, but he was unable to attend. So again, I'll just give some quick updates regarding, again, ODOT specific manual, the analysis procedures manual. I think the local folks are quite familiar with the APM, but some folks that are out of state may not be familiar with the APM. It's, again, it is ODOT specific. It's a pretty comprehensive document covering, you know, the methodologies, practices, and procedures for conducting analysis of ODOT plans and projects. I have here as an image the table of contents, so you can also kind of see that the analysis is also quite varied, from safety to, you know, system planning, from mesoscopic analysis, for example, to multimodal analysis. So again, quite a bit of analysis types, and again, it is comprehensive and it is continually being updated. And the Transportation Planning Analysis Unit, again, the unit that I'm managing, is in charge of the manual and keeping it up to date. It is online. I have here a QR code. Maybe that's not the best way to share that, but maybe I can put a link in the chat afterwards. If you are curious about the APM, again, it's all online and available. Before getting into some of the updates, we do have a users group for people who are users of the APM. We do meet quarterly, and that group does review some of the updates to it, and you know, reviews and kind of approves the updates to the APM. And just kind of touching base, the last meeting that we had was relatively recent. I think it was 2 weeks ago on April 12th, and it primarily focused on really quite a big effort that ODOT is doing to implement the efforts. So this, again, this is very Oregon specific, so sorry folks that are from out of state. ODOT's leading some implementation efforts for the transportation planning rule requirements that have been updated for climate friendly and equitable communities, CFIC. We're leading several contracts, and one contract that we're leading is related to updating our modeling and analysis guidance to reflect, again, what is needed to implement these requirements. And so for that specific contract and that specific effort, the APM users group will play a pretty big role in updating ODOT's guidance. And so kind of related to the contract, there'll be opportunities to review some of the main efforts, the main technical memos related to this, but those are, you know, ultimately focused on updating the APM again, related to these requirements. So I have Zachary Horowitz's information here. He's leading those efforts, specifically the modeling and analysis effort here at ODOT. And so if you are interested in that, or you are interested in reviewing some of these, again, it'll be part of the APM users group. There'll be, I think, 5 opportunities to review these 5 main deliverables throughout a year to a year and a half through the users group. But again, if you are really interested, I know that he's forming some teams and advisory committees. So he's really the source of contact for that effort. The QR code here is related to the ODOT's implementation efforts as a whole regarding the CFEC requirements. Sorry for that caveat. It's actually pretty complicated and a lot of moving parts currently related to those. The next APM users group meeting is tentatively scheduled for July 12th. And the main part of that will be related to training for the CAV related work efforts that we've been doing, incorporating CAV considerations into the APM. So currently there's a project that was actually part of a pooled fund nationally related to, again, incorporating CAV into some type of these analysis. Most prominently, it was also in the latest update to the highway capacity manual where they had some capacity considerations for CAV market penetration. ODOT kind of had a follow-up contract related to that work to incorporate CAVs a little bit more clearly and directly into the APM. And so that work is wrapping up, and really the contract ends at the end of June. And so again, it's anticipated that this meeting will be training and more in-depth walkthrough of that, again, as it specifically relates to the APM. Again, I apologize for the folks that may not be familiar with the APM. These are pretty specific updates. But again, getting to the actual updates. So chapter 19 of traffic analysis documentation, this chapter has been updated and it was sent out for review for the APM users group. We did ask for comments by April 21st, but we will also accept comments here in the next couple of days. And that will be updated based off of those comments and then posted online to be officially updated into the APM. There's also work on chapter 16, the environmental traffic data chapter. There's been a complete second draft for noise studies has been completed. This will go for kind of more of an internal environmental ODOT staff review, but there's also an intention to, for a portion of that analysis, to also go to the APM users group for comment here shortly. I kind of covered the CAV work. As I mentioned, again, this is through a contract with Kittleson, and they're working kind of on the final draft changes to the APM, again, incorporating those CAV considerations and some of that work previously done. This will primarily impact basically it'll be 2 new appendices to chapter 6, which is the future year forecasting chapter, which will show kind of the, again, these kind of considerations, kind of the workflow of how to do these CAV considerations and examples. There's also minor changes to chapter 11, which is the segment facility analysis chapter, and chapter 13, which is signalized intersection chapter. But those are pretty minor changes that are primarily part of like those stop yield notes to refer back to the chapter 6 appendices. As I mentioned, that contract ends June 30th, and that work is wrapping up accordingly. And as I mentioned, before or on that APM users group meeting in July, everyone will kind of see the changes to that and provide comments as appropriate. Another that has been posted online has been this Appendix 10A, which is related to aux lanes. And that's kind of just defining a better definition of aux lanes and what the function of aux lanes are based off of length. That's again online. And really, as you can see, this is really a lot of work, the APM and updating it properly. And so there's several things that are continually being updated. And so there is a little bit of a backlog, honestly, on some of the things, but some of the main upcoming work, again, eventually the updates related to the CFAC requirements will be incorporated into the APM. There will be also updates from the newest highway safety manual, the 2nd edition, and I think those are primarily related to 2-lane analysis. And then also currently there's some refreshing of the appendices to chapter 12 and chapter 13. And really there's a long list of planned other updates as well. But these are kind of the main updates I wanted to share with the group. I apologize for taking so long. And one thing I wanted to mention too, this is totally separate from what I just mentioned, but TRB, Committee on Traffic Simulation, has the Transportation System Simulation Manual, and there'll be a workshop at the upcoming ITE annual meeting that introduces practitioners to the simulation manual, and there's information about this workshop here. If you are interested, I'm still kind of working on who's involved and the specifics of it, so if you are interested in helping or participating in that, please let me know. And this is my contact information, and this is again the QR code to the APM. Thank you, everyone. Sorry it took so long, Randy.
Awesome, no worries, right on time. And it looks like all of the questions we had in the chat have been addressed, so we're right at 1 o'clock. So for those of you joining virtually, thank you so much for listening in. Hopefully you found this useful, and you know, we try to host just a handful of events a year, and hopefully there'll be more in the future that you guys will find interesting. So just try to stay in touch with Oregon ITE. You can check out our website, oregonite.org. And have a great day, everybody. And